basis of their offensive against Catholicism was quite untenable. The only way to remedy the evil I have been speaking of is to train the Germans from youth upwards to an absolute recognition of the rights of their own people, instead of poisoning their minds
We need headphones.
while they are still only children with the virus of this curbed objectivity, even in matters concerning the very maintenance of our own existence. The result of this would be that the Catholic in Germany, just as in Ireland, Poland or France, will be a German first and foremost. But all this presupposes a radical change in the national government. The strongest proof in support of my contention is furnished by what took place at that historical juncture when our people were called for the last time before the tribunal of history to defend their own existence in a life-or-death struggle. As long as there was no lack of leadership in the higher circles, the people fulfilled their duty and obligations to an overwhelming extent. But a Protestant pastor or Catholic priest each did his very utmost in helping our powers of resistance to hold out, not only in the trenches, but also, and even more so, at home. During those years, and especially during the first outburst of enthusiasm, in both religious camps there was one undivided and sacred German empire for whose preservation and future existence they all prayed to heaven. The Pan-German movement in Austria ought to have asked itself this one question: is the maintenance of the German element in Austria possible or not, as long as that element remains within the fold of the Catholic faith? If that question should have been answered in the affirmative, then the political party should not have meddled in religious and denominational questions. But if the question had to be answered in the negative, then a religious reformation should have been started, and not a political party movement. File 26. Anyone who believes that a religious reformation can be achieved through the agency of a political organization shows that he has no idea of the development of religious conceptions and doctrines of faith, and how these are given practical effect by the Church. No man can serve two masters, and I hold that the foundation or overthrow of a religion has far greater consequences than the foundation or overthrow of a state, to say nothing of a party. It is no argument to the contrary to say that the attacks were only defensive measures against attacks from the other side. Undoubtedly, there have always been unscrupulous rogues who did not hesitate to degrade religion to the base uses of politics. Nearly always, such a people had nothing else in their minds except to make a business of religions and politics. But on the other hand, it would be wrong to hold religion itself, or a religious denomination, responsible for a number of rascals who exploit the Church for their own base interests, just as they would exploit anything else in which they had a part. Nothing could be more to the taste of one of these parliamentary loungers and tricksters than to be able to find a scapegoat for his political sharp practice, after the event, of course. The moment religion or a religious denomination is attacked and made responsible for his personal misdeeds, this shrewd fellow will raise a row at once and call the world to witness how justified he was in acting as he did, proclaiming that he and his eloquence alone had saved religion and the Church. The public, which is mostly stupid and has a very short memory, is not capable of recognizing the real instigator of the quarrel in the midst of the turmoil that has been raised. Frequently, it does not remember the beginning of the fight until the rogue gets by with his stunt. A cunning fellow of that sort is quite well aware that his misdeeds have nothing to do with religion, and so he will laugh up his sleeve all the more heartily when his honest but artless adversary loses the game, and one day, losing all faith in humanity, retires from the activities of public life. But from another viewpoint also, it would be wrong to make religion, or the church as such, responsible for the misdeeds of individuals. If one compares the magnitude of the organization as it stands
File 1, no one works,
with the average weakness of human nature, we shall have to admit that the proportion of good to bad is more favorable here than anywhere else. Among the priests there may, of course, be some who use their sacred calling to further their political ambitions. There are clergy who unfortunately forget that in the political melee they ought to be the paladins of the more sublime truths and not the abettors of falsehood and slander. But for each one of these unworthy specimens, we can find 1,000 or more who fulfill their mission nobly as the trustworthy guardians of souls, and who tower above the level of our corrupt epoch as little islands above the sea swamp. I cannot condemn the church as such, and I should feel quite as little justified in doing so if some depraved person in the robe of a priest commits some offence against the moral law. Nor should I for a moment think of blaming the church if one of its innumerable members betrays and besmirches his compatriots, especially not in epochs when such conduct is quite common. We must not forget, particularly our day, that for one such there are 1,000 whose hearts bleed in sympathy with their people during these years of misfortune, and who, together with the best of our nation, yearn for the hour when fortune will smile on us again. If it be objected that here we are concerned not with the petty problems of everyday life, but principally with fundamental truths and questions of dogma, the only way of answering that objection is to ask a question. Do you feel that Providence has called you to proclaim the truth to the world? If so, then go and do it. But you ought to have the courage to do it directly, and not use some political party as your mouthpiece, for in this way you shirk your vocation. In the place of something that now exists and is bad, put something else that is better and will last into the future. If you lack the requisite courage, or if you yourself do not know clearly what your better substitute ought to be, leave the whole thing alone. But whatever happens, do not try to reach the goal by the roundabout way of a political party.
To something that is alien to the national well-being, and thus calculated to undermine racial customs and morals. If some ecclesiastical dignitaries should misuse religious ceremonies or religious teaching to injure their own nation, their opponents ought never to take the same road and fight them with the same weapons. To a political leader, the religious teachings and practices of his people should be sacred and inviolable, Otherwise, he should not be a statesman, but a reformer, if he has the necessary qualities for such a mission. Any other line of conduct will lead to disaster, especially in Germany.
I will consider what I can
In
do for
studying
this
the pan-German movement and its conflict with Rome, I was then firmly persuaded, and especially in the course of later years, that by their failure to understand the importance of the social problem, the pan-Germanists lost the support of the broad masses, who are the indispensable combatants in such a movement. By entering Parliament, the pan-German leaders deprived themselves of the great driving force which resides in the masses, and at the same time they laid on their own shoulders all the defects of the parliamentary institution. Their struggle against the Church made their position impossible in numerous circles of the lower and middle classes, while at the same time it robbed them of innumerable high-class elements, some of the best indeed that the nation possessed. The practical outcome of the Austrian Kulturkampf was negative. Although they succeeded in winning 100,000 members away from the Church, that did not do much harm to the latter. The Church did not really need to shed any tears over these lost sheep, for it lost only those who had for a long time ceased to belong to it in their inner hearts. The difference between this new Reformation and the Great Reformation was that in the historic epoch of the Great Reformation, some of the best members left the Church because of religious convictions, whereas in this new Reformation, only those left who had been indifferent before and who are now influenced by political considerations. From the political point of view alone, the result was as ridiculous as it was deplorable. Once again, a political movement which had promised so much for the German nation collapsed, because it was not conducted in a spirit of unflinching adherence to naked reality, but lost itself in fields where it was bound to get broken up. The pan-German movement would never have made this mistake if it had properly understood the psyche of the broad masses. If the leaders had known that, for psychological reasons alone, it is not expedient to place 2 or more sets of adversaries before the masses, since that leads to a complete splitting up of their fighting strength, they would have concentrated the full and undivided force of their attack against a single adversary. Nothing in the policy of a political party is so fraught with danger as to allow its decisions to be directed by people who want to have their fingers in every pie, though they do not know how to cook the simplest dish. But even though there is much that can really be said against various religious denominations, political leaders must not forget that the experience of history teaches us that no purely political party in similar circumstances ever succeeded in bringing about a religious reformation. One does not study history for the purpose of forgetting or mistrusting its lessons afterwards, when the time comes to apply these lessons in practice. It would be a mistake to believe that in this particular case things were different, so that the eternal truths of history were no longer applicable. One learns history in order to be able to apply its lessons to the present time, and whoever fails to do this cannot pretend to be a political leader. In reality, he is quite a superficial person, or, as is mostly the case, a conceited simpleton, whose good intentions cannot make up for his incompetence in practical affairs. The art of leadership, as displayed by really great popular leaders in all ages consists in consolidating the attention of the people against a single adversary and taking care that nothing will split up that attention into sections. The more the militant energies of the people are directed towards one objective, the more will new recruits join the movement, attracted by the magnetism of its unified action. And thus the striking power will be all the more enhanced. The leader of genius must have the ability to make different opponents appear as if they belong to the one category. For weak and wavering natures among a leader's following may easily begin to be dubious about the justice of their own cause if they have to face different enemies. As soon as the vacillating masses find themselves facing an opposition that is made up of different groups of enemies, their sense of objectivity will be aroused, and they will ask, how is it that all the others can be in the wrong and they themselves and their movement alone in the right? Such a feeling would be the first step towards a paralysis of their fighting vigor. Where there are various enemies who are split up into divergent groups, it will be necessary to block them all together as forming one solid front, so that the mass of followers in a popular movement may see only one common enemy against whom they have to fight. Such uniformity intensifies their belief in the justice of their own cause and strengthens their feeling of hostility towards the opponent. The Pan-German movement was unsuccessful because the leaders did not grasp the significance of that truth. They saw the goal clearly, and their intentions were right, but they took the wrong road. Their action may be compared to that of an alpine climber who never loses sight of the peak he wants to reach, who has set out with the greatest determination and energy, but pays no attention to the road beneath his feet. With his eye always fixed firmly on the goal, he does not think over or notice the nature of the ascent. And finally, he fails.
File 27.
The manner in which the great rival of the Pan-German party set out to attain its goal was quite different. The way it took was well and shrewdly chosen, but it did not have a clear vision of the goal. In almost all the questions where the Pan-German movement failed, the policy of the Christian Socialist Party was correct and systematic. They assessed the importance of the masses correctly, and thus they gained the support of large numbers of the popular masses by emphasizing the social character of the movement from the very start. By directing their appeal especially to the lower middle class and the artisans, they gained adherents who were faithful, persevering, and self-sacrificing. The Christian Socialist leaders took care to avoid all controversy with the institutions of religion, and thus they secured the support of that mighty organization, the Catholic Church. Those leaders recognized the value of propaganda on a large scale, and they were veritable virtuosos in working up the spiritual instincts of the broad masses of their adherents. The failure of this party to carry into effect the dream of saving Austria from dissolution must be attributed to two main defects in the means they employed, and also the lack of a clear perception of the ends they wished to reach. The anti-Semitism of the Christian Socialists was based on religious instead of racial principles. The reason for this mistake gave rise to the second error also.
Hello.
The founders of the Christian Socialist Party were of the opinion that they could not base their position on the racial principle, if they wished to save Austria, because they felt that a general disintegration of the state might quickly result from the adoption of such a policy. In the opinion of the party chiefs, the situation in Vienna demanded that all factors which tended to estrange the nationalists from one another should be carefully avoided, and that all factors making for unity should be encouraged. At that time, Vienna was so honeycombed with foreign elements, especially the Czechs, that the greatest amount of tolerance was necessary if these elements were to be enlisted in the ranks of any party that was not anti-German on principle. If Austria was to be saved, those elements were indispensable. And so attempts were made to win the support of the small traders, a great number of whom were Czechs, by combating the liberalism of the Manchester School. And they believed that by adopting this attitude, they had found a slogan against Jewry, which, because of its religious implications, would unite all the different nationalities which made up the population of the old Austria. It was obvious, however, that this kind of anti-Semitism did not upset the Jews very much, simply because it had a purely religious foundation. If the worst came to the worst, a few drops of baptismal water would settle the matter. Hereupon, the Jew could still carry on his business safely, and at the same time retain his Jewish nationality. On such superficial grounds, it was impossible to deal with the whole problem in an earnest and rational way. The consequence was that many people could not understand this kind of anti-Semitism, and therefore refused to take part in it. The attractive force of the idea was thus restricted exclusively to narrow-minded circles, because the leaders failed to go beyond the mere emotional appeal and did not ground their position on a truly rational basis. The intellectuals were opposed to such a policy on principle. It looked more and more as if the whole movement was a new attempt to proselytize the Jews, or, on the other hand, as if it were merely organized from the wish to compete with other contemporary movements. Thus, the struggle lost all traces of having been organized for a spiritual and sublime mission. Indeed, it seemed to some people, and these were by no means worthless elements, to be immoral and reprehensible. The movement failed to awaken a belief that there was a problem of vital importance for the whole of humanity, and on the solution of which the destiny of the whole Gentile world depended. Through this shilly-shally way of dealing with the problem, the anti-Semitism of the Christian socialists turned out to be quite ineffective. It was anti-Semitic only in outward appearance, and this was worse than if it had made no pretense at all to anti-Semitism. For the pretense gave rise to a false sense of security among people who believed that the enemy had been taken by the ears. But as a matter of fact, the people themselves were being led by the nose. The Jew readily adjusted himself to this form of anti-Semitism and found its continuance more profitable to him than its abolition would be. This whole movement led to great sacrifices being made for the sake of that state, which was composed of many heterogeneous nationalities. But much greater sacrifices had to be made by the trustees of the German element. One did not dare to be nationalist, even in Vienna, lest the ground should fall away from under one's feet. It was hoped that the Habsburg state might be saved by a silent evasion of the nationalist question, but this policy led that state to ruin. The same policy also led to the collapse of Christian socialism, for thus the movement was deprived of the only source of energy from which a political party can draw the necessary driving force. During those years, I carefully followed the two movements and observed how they developed. One, because my heart was with it, and the other, because of my admiration for that remarkable man, who then appeared to me as a bitter symbol of the whole German population in Austria. When the imposing funeral cortege of the dead Burgomaster wound its way from the city hall towards the Ringstrasse, I stood among the hundreds of thousands who watched the solemn procession pass by. As I stood there, I felt deeply moved, and my instinct clearly told me that the work of this man was all in vain, because a sinister fate was inexorably leading this state to its downfall. If Dr. Karl Lueger had lived in Germany, he would have been ranked among the great leaders of our people. It was a misfortune for his work and for himself that he had to live in this impossible state. When he died, the fire had already been enkindled in the Balkans and was spreading month by month. Fate had been merciful in sparing him the sight of what, even to the last, he had hoped to prevent. I endeavoured to analyse the cause which rendered one of those movements futile and wrecked the process of the other. The result of this investigation was the profound conviction that, apart from the inherent impossibility of consolidating the position of the state in the old Austria, the two parties made the following fatal mistake. The Pan-German party was perfectly right in its fundamental ideas regarding the aim of the movement, which was to bring about a German restoration. But it was unfortunate in the choice of means. It was nationalist, but unfortunately it paid too little heed to the social problem, and thus it failed to gain the support of the masses. Its anti-Jewish policy, however, was grounded on a correct perception of the significance of the racial problem, and not on religious principles. But it was mistaken in its assessment of facts, and adopted the wrong tactics when it made war against one of the religious denominations. The Christian Socialist movement had only a vague concept of a German revival as part of its objects, but it was intelligent and fortunate in the choice of means to carry out its policy as a party. The Christian Socialists grasped the significance of the social question, but they adopted the wrong principles in their struggle against Jewry, and they utterly failed to appreciate the value of the national idea as a source of political energy. If the Christian Socialist Party, together with its shrewd judgment in regard to the worth of the popular masses, had only judged rightly also on the importance of the racial problem, which was properly grasped by the Pan-German movement, and if this party had been really nationalist, or if the Pan-German leaders, on the other hand, in addition to their correct judgment of the Jewish problem and of the national idea, had adopted the practical wisdom of the Christian Socialist Party, and particularly their attitude towards socialism, then a movement would have developed which, in my opinion, might at that time have successfully altered the course of German destiny. If things did not turn out thus, the fault lay for the most part in the inherent nature of the Austrian state. I did not find my own convictions upheld by any party then in existence, and so I could not bring myself to enlist as a member in any of the existing organizations, or even lend a hand in their struggle. Even at that time, All those organizations seemed to me to be already jaded in their energies, and were therefore incapable of bringing about a national revival of the German people in a really profound way, not merely outwardly. My inner aversion to the Habsburg state was increasing daily. The more I paid special attention to questions of foreign policy, the more the conviction grew upon me that this phantom state would surely bring misfortune on the Germans. I realized more and more that the destiny of the German nation could not be decisively influenced from here, but only in the German Empire itself. And this was true not only in regard to general political questions, but also, and in no less a degree, in regard to the whole sphere of cultural life. Here also, in matters affecting the national culture and art, the Austrian state showed all the signs of senile decrepitude, or at least it was ceasing to be of any consequence to the German nation, as far as these matters were concerned. This was especially true of its architecture. Modern architecture could not produce any great results in Austria, because since the building of the Ringstrasse, at least in Vienna, architectural activities had become insignificant when compared with the progressive plans which were being thought out in Germany. And so I came more and more to lead what may be called a twofold existence. Reason and reality forced me to continue my harsh apprenticeship in Austria, though I must now say that this apprenticeship turned out fortunate in the end. But my heart was elsewhere. A feeling of discontent grew upon me and made me depressed the more I came to realize the inside hollowness of this state and the impossibility of saving it from collapse. At the same time, I felt perfectly certain that it would bring all kinds of misfortune to the German people. I was convinced that the Habsburg state would balk and hinder every German who might show signs of real greatness, while at the same time it would aid and abet every non-German activity. This conglomerate spectacle of heterogeneous races, which the capital of the dual monarchy presented, this motley of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs and Croats, etc., and always that bacillus which is the solvent of human society, the Jew, here and there and everywhere. The whole spectacle was repugnant to me. The gigantic city seemed to be the incarnation of mongrel brutality. The German language, which I had spoken from the time of my boyhood, was the vernacular idiom of Lower Bavaria. I never forgot that particular style of speech, and I could never learn the Viennese dialect. The longer I lived in that city, the stronger became my hatred for the promiscuous swarm of foreign peoples which had begun to batten on that old nursery ground of German culture.
The fuck is this guy on
The idea
about?
that this state could maintain its further existence for any considerable time was quite absurd. Austria was then like a piece of ancient mosaic, in which the cohesive cement had dried up and become old and friable. As long as such a work of art remains untouched, it may hold together and continue to exist. But the moment some blow is struck on it, then it breaks up into thousands of fragments. Therefore, it was now only a question of when the blow would come. because my heart was always with the German Empire and not with the Austrian monarchy. The hour of Austria's dissolution as a state appeared to me as only the first step towards the emancipation of the German nation. All these considerations intensified my yearning to depart for that country for which my heart had been secretly longing since the days of my youth. I hoped that one day I might be able to make my mark as an architect,
Better off
and that
only
I
going
could
to
devote
15
my
and then
talents to
repeating.
the service of my country on a large or small scale, according to the will of fate. A final reason was that I longed to be among those who lived and worked in that land from which the movement should be launched, the object of which would be the fulfillment of what my heart had always longed for, namely, the union of the country in which I was born with our common fatherland, the German Empire. There are many who may not understand how such a yearning can be so strong, but I appeal especially to two groups of people. The first includes all those who are still denied the happiness I have spoken of, and the second embraces those who once enjoyed that happiness, but had it torn from them by a harsh fate. I turn to all those who have been torn from their motherland, and who have to struggle for the preservation of their most sacred patrimony, their native language, persecuted and harried because of their loyalty and love for the homeland, yearning sadly for the hour when they will be allowed to return to the bosom of their father's household. To these I address my words, and I know that they will understand. Only he who has experienced in his own inner life what it means to be German, and yet to be denied the right of belonging to his fatherland, can appreciate the profound nostalgia which that enforced exile causes. It is a perpetual heartache, and there is no place for joy and contentment until the doors of paternal home are thrown open, and all those through whose veins kindred blood is flowing will find peace and rest in their common right. Vienna was a hard school for me, but it taught me the most profound lessons of my life. I was scarcely more than a boy when I came to live there, and when I left, I had grown to be a man of a grave and pensive nature. In Vienna, I acquired the foundations of a Weltanschauung in general, and developed a faculty for analyzing political questions in particular. That Weltanschauung and the political ideas that formed have never been abandoned, though they were expanded later on in some directions. It is only now that I can fully appreciate how valuable those years of apprenticeship were for me. That is why I have given a detailed account of this period. There, in Vienna, stark reality taught me the truths that now form the fundamental principles of the party which, within the course of 5 years, has grown from modest beginnings to a great mass movement. I do not know what my attitude towards Jewry, social democracy, or rather Marxism in general, to the social problem, etc., would be today if I had not acquired a stock of personal beliefs at such an early age by dint of hard study and under the duress of fate. For, although the misfortunes of the fatherland may have stimulated thousands and thousands to ponder over the inner causes of the collapse, that could not lead to such a thorough knowledge and deep insight as a man may develop, who has fought a hard struggle for many years, so that he might be master of his own fate.
Keep fighting. Another opportunity to extract will appear soon.
File 28.
Chapter 4. Munich. At last, I came to Munich in the spring of 1912. The city itself was as familiar to me as if I had lived there for years within walls. This was because my studies in architecture had been constantly turning my attention to the metropolis of German art. One must know Munich if one would know German, and it is impossible to acquire a knowledge of German art without seeing Munich. All things considered, this pre-war sojourn was by far the happiest and most contented of my life. My earnings were very slender, but after all I did not live for the sake of painting. I painted in order to get the bare necessities of existence while I continued my studies. I was firmly convinced that I should finally succeed in reaching the goal I had marked out for myself, and this conviction alone was strong enough to enable me to bear the petty hardships of everyday life without worrying very much about them. Moreover, almost from the very first moment of my sojourn there, I came to love that city more than any other place known to me. A German city, I said to myself. How different to Vienna. It was with a feeling of disgust that my imagination reverted to that Babylon of races. Another pleasant feature here was the way the people spoke German, which was much nearer my own way of speaking than the Viennese idiom. The Munich idiom recalled the days of my youth, especially when I spoke with those who had come to Munich from Lower Bavaria. There were 1,000 or more things which I inwardly loved, or which I came to love during the course of my stay. But what attracted me most was the marvelous wedlock of native folk energy with the fine artistic spirit of the city, that unique harmony from the Hofbrauhaus to the Odeon, from the October Festival to the Pinakothek to the Church. The reason why my heartstrings are entwined around this city as around no other spot in this world is probably because Munich is and will remain inseparably connected with the development of my own career, and the fact that from the beginning of my visit I felt inwardly happy and contented is to be attributed to the charm of the marvelous Wittelsbach capital, which has attracted probably everybody who is blessed with a feeling for beauty instead of commercial instincts. Apart from my professional work, I was most interested in the study of current political events, particularly those which were concerned with foreign relations. I approached these by way of the German policy of alliances, which ever since my Austrian days I had considered to be an utterly mistaken one. But in Vienna I had not yet seen quite clearly how far the German Empire had gone in the process of self-delusion. In Vienna I was inclined to assume, or probably I persuaded myself to do so in order to excuse the German mistake, that possibly the authorities in Berlin knew how weak and unreliable their ally would prove to be when brought face to face with realities, but that for more or less mysterious reasons they refrained from allowing their opinions on this point to be known in public. Their idea was that they should support the policy of alliances which Bismarck had initiated, and the sudden discontinuance of which might be undesirable, if for no other reason than that it might arouse those foreign countries which were lying in wait for their chance, or might alarm the Philistines at home. But my contact with the people soon taught me, to my horror, that my assumptions were wrong. I was amazed to find everywhere, even in circles otherwise well informed, that nobody had the slightest intimation of the real character of the Habsburg monarchy. Among the common people in particular, there was a prevalent illusion that the Austrian ally was a power which would have to be seriously reckoned with, and would rally its manpower in the hour of need. The mass of the people continued to look upon the dual monarchy as a German state, and believed that it could be relied on. They assumed that its strength could be measured by the millions of its subjects, as was the case in Germany. First of all, they did not realize that Austria had ceased to be a German state, and secondly, that the conditions prevailing within the Austrian Empire were steadily pushing it headlong to the brink of disaster. At that time, I knew the conditions of affairs in the Austrian state better than the professional diplomats. Blindfolded, as nearly always, these diplomats stumbled along on their way to disaster. The opinions prevailing among the bulk of the people reflected only what had been drummed into them from official quarters above. And these higher authorities grovelled before the ally, as the people of old bowed down before the golden calf. They probably thought that by being polite and amiable, they might balance the lack of honesty on the other side. Thus they took every declaration at its full face value. Even while in Vienna, I used to be annoyed again and again by the discrepancy between the speeches of the official statesmen and the contents of the Viennese press. And yet, Vienna was still a German city, at least as far as appearances went. But one encountered an utterly different state of things on leaving Vienna, or rather German Austria, and coming to the Slav provinces. It needed only a glance at the Prague newspapers in order to see how the whole exalted hocus-pocus of the Triple Alliance was judged from there. In Prague, there was nothing but jibes and sneers for that masterpiece of statesmanship. Even in the piping times of peace, when the two emperors kissed each other on the brow in token of friendship, those papers did not cloak their belief that the alliance would be liquidated the moment a first attempt was made to bring it down from the shimmering glory of a Nibelungen ideal to the plane of practical affairs. Great indignation was aroused a few years later when the alliances were put to the first practical test. Italy not only withdrew from the Triple Alliance, leaving the other two members to march by themselves, but she even joined their enemies. That anybody should believe even for a moment in the possibility of such a miracle as that of Italy fighting on the same side of Austria would be simply incredible to anyone who did not suffer from the blindness of official diplomacy. And that was just how people felt in Austria also.
Very impressive, Tenno.
In Austria, only the Habsburgs and the German Austrians supported the alliance. The Habsburgs did so from shrewd calculation of their own interests and from necessity. The Germans did it out of good faith and political ignorance. They acted in good faith inasmuch as they believed that by establishing the Triple Alliance, they were doing a great service to the German Empire, and were thus helping to strengthen it and consolidate its defense. They showed their political ignorance, however, in holding such ideas, because instead of helping the German Empire, they really chained it to a moribund state, which might bring its associate into the grave with itself. And above all, by championing this alliance, they fell more and more a prey to the Habsburg policy of de-Germanization. for the alliance gave the Habsburgs good grounds for believing that the German Empire would not interfere in their domestic affairs,
What did we lose?
and thus they were in a position to carry into effect, with more ease and less risk, their domestic policy of gradually eliminating the German element. Not only could the objectiveness of the German government be counted upon, and thus there need be no fear of protest from that quarter, but one could always remind the German Austrians of the alliance, and thus silence them in case they should ever object to the reprehensible means that were being employed to establish a Slav hegemony in the dual monarchy. What could the German Austrians do
It's what we're
when the
listening to
people
today.
of the German Empire itself had openly proclaimed their trust and confidence in the Habsburg regime? Should they resist, and thus be branded openly before their kinsfolk in the Reich as traitors to their own national interests? They, who for so many decades had sacrificed so much for the sake of their German tradition. Once the influence of the Germans in Austria had been wiped out, what then would be the value of the alliance? If the Triple Alliance were to be advantageous to Germany, was it not a necessary condition that the predominance of the German element in Austria should be maintained? Or did anyone really believe that Germany could continue to be the ally of a Habsburg Empire under the hegemony of the Slavs? The official attitude of German diplomacy, as well as that of the general public towards internal problems affecting the Austrian nationalities, was not merely stupid. It was insane. On the alliance, as on a solid foundation, they grounded the security and future existence of a nation of 70 millions, while at the same time they allowed their partner to continue his policy of undermining the sole foundation of that alliance methodically and resolutely from year to year. A day must come when nothing but a formal contract with Viennese diplomats would be left. The alliance itself, as an effective support, would be lost to Germany. As far as concerned Italy, such had been the case from the outset. If people in Germany had studied history and the psychology of nations a little more carefully, not one of them could have believed for a single hour that the Quirinal and the Viennese Hofburg could ever stand shoulder to shoulder on a common battlefront. Italy would have exploded like a volcano if any Italian government had dared to send a single Italian soldier to fight for the Habsburg state. So fanatically hated was this state that the Italians could stand in no other relation to it on a battlefront except as enemies. More than once in Vienna I have witnessed explosions of the contempt and profound hatred which allied the Italian to the Austrian state. The crimes which the House of Habsburg committed against Italian freedom and independence during several centuries were too grave to be forgiven, even with the best of goodwill. But this goodwill did not exist, either among the rank and file of the population or in the government. Therefore, for Italy, there were only two ways of coexisting with Austria: alliance or war. By choosing the first, it was possible to prepare leisurely for the second. Especially since relations between Russia and Austria tended more and more towards the arbitrament of war, the German policy of alliances was as senseless as it was dangerous. Here was a classical instance which demonstrated the lack of any broad or logical lines of thought. But what was the reason for forming the alliance at all? It could not have been other than the wish to secure the future of the Reich better than if it were to depend exclusively on its own resources. But the future of the Reich could not have meant anything else than the problem of securing the means of existence for the German people. The only questions, therefore, were the following. What form shall the life of the nation assume in the near future? That is to say, within such a period as we can forecast. And by what means can the necessary foundation and security be guaranteed for this development within the framework of the general distribution of power amongst the European nations? A clear analysis of the principles on which the foreign policy of German statecraft were to be based should have led to the following conclusions. The annual increase of population in Germany amounts to almost 900,000 souls. The difficulties of providing for this army of new citizens must grow from year to year and must finally lead to catastrophe, unless ways and means are found which will forestall the danger of misery and hunger. There were 4 ways of providing against this terrible calamity.
File 29.
1. It was possible to accept the French example and artificially restrict the number of births, thus avoiding an excess of population. Under certain circumstances, in periods of distress or under bad climatic condition, or if the soil yields too poor a return, nature herself tends to check the increase of population in some countries and among some races, but by a method which is quite as ruthless as it is wise. It does not impede the procreative faculty as such, but it does impede the further existence of the offspring by submitting it to such tests and privations that everything which is less
Ember is
or
definitely not
less
one of my
healthy
favorites.
is forced
Just
to retreat
really efficient
into the
for this
bosom of the unknown.
mission.
Whatever survives these hardships of existence has been tested and tried 1,000-fold, hardened and rendered fit to continue the process of procreation, so that the same thorough selection will begin all over again, by thus dealing brutally with the
Nidus
individual
is pretty good.
and recalling him the
I
very
like Rhino
moment
if
he
I really
shows
don't
that
want
he
to
is
pay
not
attention
fitted for the
too
trials
much to the
of
game.
life. Nature preserves
I'm
the
just gonna
strength of the race and the species, and
brute
raises
forcing
it
a
to the
mission.
highest degree of efficiency. The decrease in numbers,
Nidus
therefore,
is fantastic
implies an
for
increase of
any
strength
kind of survival.
as far as the individual is concerned, and this finally
Not
means
so great in
the
a group, though.
invigoration of the species.
Yeah.
But the case is different when man himself starts the process of numerical restriction. Man is not carved from nature's wood. He is made of human material. He knows more than the ruthless queen of wisdom. He does not impede the preservation of the individual, but prevents procreation itself. To the individual, who always sees only himself and not the race, this line of action seems more humane and just than the opposite
I haven't tried Gara yet.
but unfortunately, the consequences are also
I am
the
currently working towards
by leaving the
Chroma
process of
if I can.
procreation unchecked, and by submitting the individual to the hardest preparatory tests in life, nature selects the best from an abundance of single elements and stamps them as fit to live and carry on the conservation of the species. But man restricts the procreative faculty and strives obstinately to keep alive at any cost whatever once has been born. This correction of the divine will seems to him to be wise and humane, and he rejoices at having trumped nature's card in one game at least, and thus proved that she is not entirely reliable. The dear little ape of an almighty father is delighted
Just trying to
see
figure
and
out what I
hear
can learn
that
from
he has
it.
succeeded in effecting a numerical restriction. But he would be very displeased if told that this, his system, brings about a degeneration in personal quality. For as soon as the procreative faculty is thwarted and the number of births diminished, the natural struggle for existence, which allows only healthy and strong individuals to survive, is replaced by a sheer craze to save feeble and even diseased creatures.
Mostly
at any
I'm doing
cost.
this to
And thus
grind out
the
oxygen.
seeds are sown for a human progeny which will become more and more miserable from one generation to another, as long as nature's will is scorned. But if that policy be
Well, the words
carried out,
themselves might
the
be
final
just bullshit.
results must be
But
that
it's the
such a
thoughts behind the
nation will
words that I'm
eventually
interested in.
terminate its own existence on this earth. For though man may defy the eternal laws of procreation during a certain period, vengeance will follow sooner or later. A stronger race will oust that which has grown weak, for the vital urge, in its ultimate form, will burst asunder all the absurd chains of this so-called humane consideration for the individual, and will replace it with the humanity of nature, which wipes out what is weak in order to give place to the strong. Any policy which aims at securing the existence of a nation by restricting the
Another
birth rate
opportunity to extract will
robs
appear
that
soon.
nation of its future. 2. A second solution is that of internal colonization. This is a proposal which is frequently made in our own time, and one hears it lauded a good deal. It is a suggestion that is well meant, but is misunderstood by most people, so that it is the source of more mischief than can be imagined. It is certainly true that the productivity of the soil can be increased within certain limits, but only within defined limits, and not indefinitely. By increasing the productive powers of the soil, it will be
Yeah.
possible to balance the effect of a surplus birth rate in Germany for a certain period of time, without
I find it
running any
interesting that he
danger
was
of
capable
hunger.
of moving so many
But we have
people
to
for the
face
same
the fact
ridiculous ideas.
that the general standard of living is rising more quickly than even the birth rate. The requirements of food and clothing are becoming greater from year to year, and are out of proportion to those of our ancestors of, let us say, 100 years ago. It would therefore be a mistaken view that every increase in the
Oxygen.
productive powers of the soil will supply the requisite conditions for an increase in the population. No. That is true up to a certain point only. For at least a portion of the increased produce of the soil will be consumed by the margin of increased demands caused by the steady rise in the standard of living. But even if these demands were to be curtailed to the narrowest limits possible, and if at the same time we were to use all our available energies in the intense cultivation, we should here reach a definite limit, which is conditioned by the inherent nature of the soil itself. No matter how industriously we may labor, we cannot increase agricultural production beyond this limit. Therefore, though we may postpone the evil hour of distress for a certain time, it will arrive at last. The first phenomenon will be the recurrence of famine periods from time to time after bad harvests, etc. The intervals between these famines will become shorter and shorter the more the population increases. And finally, the famine times will disappear only in those rare years of plenty when the granaries are full. And a time will ultimately come when even in those years of plenty, there will be not enough to go round, so that hunger will dog the footsteps of the nation. Nature must now step in once more and select those who are to survive, or else man will help himself by artificially preventing his own increase, with all the fatal consequences for the race and the species, which have already been mentioned.
I think we should expand
It may be objective
fast
here
and
that
as hard as
in
we
one
can.
form or another, this future is in store for all mankind, and that the individual
As they say,
nation
many
or
hands
race
makes light work.
cannot escape the general fate. At first glance, that objection seems logical enough, but we have to take the following into account. The day will certainly come when the whole of mankind will be forced to
I won't
check
be
the
censored.
augmentation
I don't give a
of
fuck.
the
They can
human
ban me if
species,
they want. That's their
because
choice.
there will be no further possibility of adjusting the productivity of the soil to the perpetual increase
There's stuff to
in
be
the
learned. You
population.
can't fucking censor stuff.
Nature must then be allowed to use her own methods, or man may possibly take the task of regulation into his own hands and establish the necessary equilibrium by the application of better means than we have at our disposal today. But then it will be a problem for mankind as a whole. Whereas now, only those races have to suffer from want which no longer have the strength when daring to acquire sufficient soil to fulfill their needs.
Almost lost all my
For as
shield
things
there.
stand
Sorry.
today, vast spaces still lie uncultivated all over the surface of the
That's
globe.
last of them. Objective is
Those
secured.
spaces
Let's
are
go.
only waiting for the ploughshare. And it is quite certain that nature did not set those territories apart as the exclusive pastures of any one nation or race, to be held unutilized in reserve for the future. Such land awaits the people who have the strength to acquire it and the diligence to cultivate it. Nature knows no political frontiers. She begins by establishing life on this globe and then watches the free play of forces. Those who show the greatest courage and industry are the children nearest to her heart, and they will be granted the sovereign right of existence. If a nation confines itself to internal colonization, while other races are perpetually increasing their territorial annexations all over the globe, that nation will be forced to restrict the numerical growth of its population at a time when the other nations are increasing theirs. This situation must eventually arrive. It will arrive soon if the territory which the nation has at its disposal be small. Now, it is unfortunately true that only too often the best nations, or to speak more exactly, the only really cultured nations, who at the same time are the chief bearers of human progress, have decided in their blind pacifism to refrain from the acquisition of new territory and to be content with internal colonization.
Alrighty then.
But at the same time, nations of inferior quality succeed in getting hold of large spaces for colonization all over the globe. The state of affairs which must result from this contrast is the following. Races which are culturally superior
I
but
would
less
definitely think about
ruthless would be forced to restrict their increase because of insufficient territory to support the population, while less civilized races could increase indefinitely, owing to the vast territories at their disposal. In other words, should that state of affairs continue, then the world will one day be possessed by that portion of mankind which is culturally inferior, but more active
But that
and
kind of
energetic.
stuff is available at schools.
A time will come,
My whole point is
even
to
though in the
present
distant future,
stuff
when
that
there
other
can
people would
only
have
be
me
two
censor.
alternatives. Either the world will be ruled according to our modern concept of democracy, and then every decision will be in favor of the numerically stronger races, or the world will be governed by the law of natural distribution of power. And then those nations will be victorious who are of more brutal will and are not the nations who have practiced self-denial. Nobody can doubt that this world will one day be the scene of dreadful struggles for
All right,
existence
let's go, bitches.
on the part of mankind. In the end, the instinct of self-preservation alone will triumph. Before its consuming fire, this so-called humanitarianism, which connotes only a mixture of fatuous timidity and self-conceit, will melt away as under the March sunshine. Man has become great through perpetual struggle. In perpetual peace, his greatness must decline.
File 30.
For us Germans, the slogan of internal colonization is fatal, because it encourages the belief that we have discovered a means which is in accordance with our innate pacifism, and which will enable us to work for our livelihood in a half-slumbering existence. Such a teaching, once it were taken seriously by our people, would mean the end of all effort to acquire for ourselves that place in the world which we deserve. If the average German were once convinced that by this means he has the chance of ensuring his livelihood and guaranteeing his future, any attempt to take an active and profitable part in sustaining the vital demands of his country would be out of the question. Should the nation agree to such an attitude, then any really useful foreign policy might be looked upon as dead and buried, together with all hope for the future of the German people.
That was easy, Wave.
Once we know what the consequences of this internal colonization theory will be, we can no longer consider as a mere accident the fact that among those who inculcate this quite pernicious mentality among our people, the Jew is always in the first line. He
Oh,
knows
and
his
keep in mind, the
soft is
stream
only
isn't
too well
normally
not
this,
to know that they
low
are
quality.
ready to be the grateful
internet is broken,
victims
and
of every
they need days to
swindle
fix
which
it,
promises
apparently.
them a gold block in the shape of a discovery that will enable them to outwit nature
And I would do
and thus
4K,
render superfluous the hard and
I got the
inexorable
bandwidth for
struggle
it,
for existence.
but there's no way to do 4K on
so that
YouTube.
finally
and
they may become
1080p
lords of the
too.
planet partly by sheer
Right.
dolce far niente,
It bothers
and
me.
partly by working when a pleasing opportunity arises. It cannot be too strongly emphasized that any German internal colonization must first of all be considered as suitable only for the relief of social grievances.
Oh, I got
to carry out a system of
20 to 30
colonization.
megabits per second
The most
upload.
important preliminary measure would be to free the soil from the grip of the speculator
But
and assure
something in
that
the internet
freedom.
broke, and they're trying
But
to
such
figure
a
out what it
system
is.
could never suffice
believe
to
them,
assure the future of
if
the
that's the
nation
truth, then
without
that's what it
the
is.
acquisition of new territory. If we adopt a different plan, we shall soon reach a point beyond
Demanding.
which the resources of our soil can no longer be exploited, and at the same time we shall reach a point beyond which our manpower
Wait,
cannot
it's not an
develop.
issue with the computer.
In conclusion,
I can run Warframe top quality all day.
the fact that only up to a limited extent can internal colonization be practiced in a national territory which is of definitely small area, and the restriction of the procreative
But they can't provide,
faculty which follows as a result of such conditions, these two factors have a very unfavorable effect on the military and political standing of a nation. The extent of the national territory is a determining factor in the external security
What kind of computer do you have,
nation. The larger the territory which a people has at its disposal, the stronger are the national defenses of that people. Military decisions are more quickly, more easily, more completely and more effectively gained against a people occupying a national territory which is restricted in area than against states which have
good.
extensive territories.
That's nice to hear.
Moreover, the magnitude of a national territory is in
I'm gonna
itself a certain assurance that an outside power will not hastily risk the adventure of an invasion. For in that
You should
case,
have no problem then.
the struggle would have to be long and exhausting before victory could
Are you talking about 4K streaming?
the risk being so great, there would have to be extraordinary reasons for such an aggressive adventure. Hence it is that the territorial magnitude of a state furnishes a base whereon national liberty and independence can be maintained with relative ease, while, on the contrary, a state whose territory is small offers a natural temptation to the invader. As a matter of fact, so-called national circles in the German Reich rejected those first two possibilities of establishing a balance between the constant numerical increase in the population and a national territory which could not expand proportionately. But the reasons given for that rejection were different from those which I have just expounded. It was mainly on the basis of certain moral sentiments
I use
that
Restream,
restriction
so
of the birth
I
rate
let them take
was
care of it.
objected to. Proposals for internal colonization
That way I could
were
stream to both of them
rejected
at the same time.
indignantly because it was suspected that such a policy might mean an attack on the big landowners, and that this attack might be the forerunner of a general assault against the principle of private property as a whole.
That's fantastic.
The form in which the latter solution, internal colonization, was recommended justified the misgivings of the big landowners. But the form in which the colonization proposal was rejected was not very clever as regards the impression which such rejection might be calculated to make on the mass of the people. And anyhow, it did not go to the root of the problem at all. Only two
All right.
further ways
Thanks for
were
coming
left
around to
open,
the stream.
in which work and bread could be secured for the increasing population. 3. It was possible to think of acquiring new territory on which a certain portion of the increasing population could be settled each year. Or else, 4. Our industry and commerce had to be organized in such a manner as to secure an increase in the exports and thus be able to support our people by the increased purchasing power accruing from the profits made on foreign markets. Therefore, the problem was a policy of territorial expansion or a colonial and commercial policy. Both policies were taken into consideration, examined, recommended, and rejected from various standpoints, with the result that the second alternative was finally adopted. The sounder alternative, however, was undoubtedly the first. The principle of acquiring new
Even I'm half
territory
dead.
on which the surplus population could be settled
Yeah, and he's down
has
again.
many
You can hold on a
advantages
sec.
to recommend it, especially if we take the
I'm gonna
future
get all better
as
first.
well as the present into account. In the first
They
place,
can last.
too much importance cannot be placed on the necessity for adopting a policy which will make it possible to maintain a healthy peasant class as the basis of the national community. Many of our present evils have their
I'm here.
origin exclusively in the disproportion between the urban and rural portions of the population. A solid stock of small and medium farmers has at all times been the best protection which a nation could have against the social diseases that are prevalent today. Moreover, that is the only solution which guarantees the daily bread of a nation within the framework of its domestic national economy. With this condition once guaranteed, Industry and commerce would retire from the unhealthy position of foremost importance which they hold today, and would take their due place within the general scheme of national economy, adjusting the balance between demand and supply.
Still making a fair amount of
Thus,
oxygen per
industry
run.
and
so
commerce
that's
would no
okay.
longer constitute the
Happy with that.
basis of the national subsistence, but would be
I'd be happier if I
auxiliary
could find a place where I could
institutions.
get more.
By fulfilling their proper function, which is to adjust the balance between national production and national consumption, they render the national
Polymer
subsistence more or less independent of foreign countries, and thus assure the freedom and independence of the nation, especially at critical junctures in its history. Such a territorial policy, however, cannot find its fulfillment in the Cameroons, but almost exclusively here in Europe. One must calmly and squarely face the truth that it certainly cannot be part of the dispensation of divine providence to give a 50 times larger share of the soil in this world to one nation than to another. In considering this state of affairs today, one must not allow existing political frontiers to distract attention from what ought to exist on principles of strict justice. If this earth has sufficient room for all, then we ought to have that share of the soil which is absolutely necessary for our existence. Of course, people will not voluntarily make that accommodation. At this point, the right of self-preservation comes into effect, and when attempts to settle the difficulty in an amicable way are rejected, the clenched hand must take by force that which was refused to the open hand of friendship. If, in the past, our ancestors had based their political decisions on similar pacifist nonsense as our present generation does, we should not possess more than 1/3 of the national territory that we possess today, and probably there would be no German nation to worry about its future in Europe. No, we owe the 2 eastern marks of the empire to the natural determination of our forefathers in their struggle for existence, and thus it is to the same determined policy that we owe the inner strength which is based on the extent of our political and racial territories, and which alone has made it possible for us to exist up to now. And there is still another reason why that solution would have been the correct one. Many contemporary European states are like pyramids standing on their apexes. The European territory which these states possess is ridiculously small when compared with the enormous overhead weight of their colonies, foreign trade, etc. It may be said that they have the apex in Europe and the base of the pyramid all over the world.
I'll be back. I'm going to see if we can
Quite
get faster
different
speeds
from
now.
the cannot be suggested as an argument against this assertion, though in glancing casually over the map of the British Empire, one is inclined easily to overlook the existence of a whole Anglo-Saxon world. England's position cannot be compared with that of any other state in Europe, since it forms a vast community of language and culture, together with the USA. Therefore, the only possibility which Germany had of carrying a sound territorial policy into effect was that of acquiring new territory in Europe itself. Colonies cannot serve this purpose as long as they are not suited for settlement by Europeans on a large scale. In the 19th century, it was no longer possible to acquire such colonies by peaceful means. Therefore, any attempt at such a colonial expansion would have meant an enormous military struggle. Consequently, it would have been more practical to undertake that military struggle for new territory in Europe, rather than to wage war for the acquisition of possessions abroad. Such a decision naturally demanded that the nation's undivided energies should be devoted
Has
to
been
it.
Up here, too.
compromised.
A policy of that kind, which requires for its fulfillment every ounce of available energy on the part of everybody concerned, cannot be carried into effect by half measures or in a hesitating manner. The political leadership of the German Empire should then have been directed exclusively to this goal. No political step should have been taken in response to other considerations than this task and the means of accomplishing it. Germany should have been alive to the fact that such a goal could have been reached only by war, and the prospect of war should have been faced with calm and collected determination. The whole system of alliances should have been envisaged and valued from that standpoint. If new territory were to be acquired in Europe, it must have been mainly at Russia's cost. And once again, the new German Empire should have set out on its march along the same road as was formerly trodden by the Teutonic Knights. This time to acquire soil for the German plough by means of the German sword, and thus provide the nation with its daily bread. For such a policy, however, there was only one possible ally in Europe, and that was England.
File 31.
Only by alliance with England was it possible to safeguard the rear of the new German crusade. The justification for undertaking such an expedition was stronger than the justification which our forefathers had for setting out on theirs. Not one of our pacifists refuses to eat the bread made from the grain grown in the East. And yet the first plough here was that called the sword. No sacrifice should have been considered as too great if it was a necessary means of gaining England's friendship. Colonial and naval ambitions should have been abandoned, and attempts should not have been made to compete against British industries. Only a clear and definite policy could lead to such an achievement. Such a policy would have demanded a renunciation of the endeavour to conquer the world's markets, also a renunciation of colonial intentions and naval power. All the means of power at the disposal of the state should have been concentrated in the military forces on land. This policy would have involved a period of temporary self-denial for the sake of a great and powerful future. There was a time when England might have entered into negotiations with us on the grounds of that proposal. For England would have well understood that the problems arising from the steady increase in population were forcing Germany to look for a solution either in Europe with the help of England, or, without England, in some other part of the world. This outlook was probably the chief reason why London tried to draw nearer to Germany about the turn of the century. For the first time in Germany, an attitude was then manifested which afterwards displayed itself in a most tragic way. People then gave expression to an unpleasant feeling that we might thus find ourselves obliged to pull England's chestnuts out of the fire. As if an alliance could be
why
based
don't you leave their
on
nuts
anything
alone?
else than mutual give and take. And England would have become party to such a mutual bargain. British diplomats were still wise enough to know that an equivalent must be forthcoming as a consideration for any services rendered. Let us suppose that in 1904 our German foreign policy was managed astutely enough to enable us to take the part which Japan played. It is not easy to measure the greatness of the results that might have accrued to Germany from such a policy. There would have been no world war. The blood which would have been shed in 1904 would not have been a tenth of that shed from 1914 to 1918. And what a position Germany would hold in the world today. In any case, the alliance with Austria was then an absurdity. For this mummy of a state did not attach itself to Germany for the purpose of carrying through a war, but rather to maintain a perpetual state of peace, which was meant to be exploited for the purpose of slowly but persistently exterminating the German element in the dual monarchy. Another reason for the impossible character of this alliance was that nobody could expect such a state to take an active part in defending German national interests, seeing that it did not have sufficient strength and determination to put an end to the policy of de-Germanization within its own frontiers. If Germany herself was not moved by a sufficiently powerful national sentiment, and was not sufficiently ruthless to take away from that absurd Habsburg state the right to decide the destinies of 10 million inhabitants, who were of the same nationality as the Germans themselves, surely it was out of the question to expect the Habsburg state to be a collaborating party in any great and courageous German undertaking. The attitude of the Old Reich towards the Austrian question might have been taken as a test of its stamina for the struggle where the destinies of the whole nation were at stake. In any case, the policy of oppression against the German population in Austria should not have been allowed to be carried on and to grow stronger from year to year, for the value of Austria as an ally could be assured only by upholding the German element there. But that, of course, was not followed. Nothing was dreaded so much as the possibility of an armed conflict. But finally, and at a most unfavorable moment, the conflict had to be faced and accepted. They thought to cut loose from the cords of destiny, but destiny held them fast. They dreamt of maintaining a world peace, and woke up to find themselves in a world war. And that dream of peace was a most significant reason why the above-mentioned third alternative for the future development of Germany was not even taken into consideration. The fact was recognized that new territory could be gained only in the east. But this meant that there would be fighting ahead,